Yeah, did it pop up with the message saying it was recorded? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Hi everyone, so welcome to today's talk. That's a deferred talk from 2 weeks ago, and Bob Hilton is going to talk to us about weathering of sedimentary rocks and feedback on climate change. If you have questions, please ask them in the chat at the end of the talk, or just unmute yourself and ask at the end of the talk. Before that, please remain muted throughout the talk so that we don't have interruptions. And today's talk is not being broadcasted on YouTube, but we're going to record the talk and then upload it later on the YouTube channel. So Rob, if you're okay with presenting as the speaker, please. Rob.
Hello, sorry, my Wi-Fi is a bit poor, so I'm disappearing.
Okay.
Right then, so before you lose me again, before I introduce Bob, can I just say that, Rob, your skills in football are immense, and you're an amazing football player. I should have, I just thought I'd say, get that in there now before I forget it, but yeah. And if you're there during the last introduction, yeah, I first met Bob Parker's piece in Cambridge, invited me to sort of kick around with your science department, and yeah, that's where I first met you. And yes, and as I said during our last introduction, that I was really impressed with your sort of leadership skills there, and I'm really glad to see that you've kind of taken this on into your academic world. And yeah, so you've ended up, you're at the University of Oxford now, but let me just run through your life. This is your life, Bob. So you did an MSci at Cambridge, where I obviously met you, PhD at Cambridge. And you did that in what was it, Taiwan, sorry, I have my mind back there in Taiwan, research fellow in Paris, and then you're a lecturer in Durham, and you've just recently got a position there in Oxford. And I'm looking forward to your talk, and I think that it's a really nice skill set, Bob, to have, obviously, to be a sedimentologist working Earth surface processes and also combining that into geochemical flux cycles. So I'm really looking forward to it. So take it away. Thanks, Bob.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks for the kind introduction, and thanks everyone for coming along again. And I think it was about here last time where everything froze, so let's see if we get further. Please shout if something's unclear along the way. I know we'll take questions at the end, but if for some reason the sound cuts out, or something, you seem to have missed something, then do flag it. It's the kind of case with the online presentation, but hopefully you've got a clear connection, and yeah, I look forward to hearing some feedback from you guys and your expertise here. And it's a shame not to be visiting in person, but one of those things, and it can still get an awful lot out of this, I hope. So anyway, I'm Bob Hilton. I'm going to be talking about this theme of weathering of sedimentary rocks, and specifically focusing on what might be driving this as a CO2 release pathway, and how the CO2 release may be influenced by various geomorphic and also climatic variables that give some interesting feedbacks that might be operating in Earth's surface. And so to do this kind of research, what we really need to do is pull, exactly as Rob said, we need to pull in kind of geomorphological and sedimentological viewpoints, but also combine them with these physical and chemical weathering processes, and also think, well, how on earth are we going to measure this stuff? And that's where the geochemistry comes in, and that's a big part of what I do, and also a big part of what the team does. So I'm going to be talking a lot about work that Guillaume Soulet, who was a postdoc on the Rock CO2 ERC funded project, led with us, and also work linked by Mathieu Dillinger and Matteo Ogreg, who worked a lot on one of the proxies I'm going to talk about today, geochemical proxies I'm going to talk about today. And also just to flag a collaborator at NERC Radiocarbon Labs, Mark Garnett, who we worked very closely with his technology and his method development. That's been absolutely crucial for driving this forward as well. And also a part of the talk will also involve work at a collaboration we set up with Matt Winnock and Jens Tarowski on a set of catchments, Alpine catchments. So without further ado, I won't talk about the background photo because I'm going to come on to that location a bit later. Oh, here we go. First glitch. There we go. So to set some context about this talk and about this research that we're doing, we're thinking about how erosion and weathering are impacting the carbon cycle, and not just impacting it, they can be driving it actually and responding to changes in the carbon cycle and climate. And argue that we're seeing a bit of a shift from a kind of almost a textbook view, which is what I've put here. I was actually just talking to our first years here about this very viewpoint, and that is that weathering acts as a drawdown pathway in this viewpoint through breakdown of silicate minerals. So how this works is we have an input of CO2 from the solid earth through here shown as volcanic degassing, which inputs CO2 into the atmosphere ocean system. And if nothing happened, that carbon dioxide would accumulate in those surface reservoirs and lead to very, very high concentrations in the atmosphere over geological timescales very quickly, unless we have a way of moving it out of that system. And so when we take the CO2, we can combine it with some water, make a weak acid, and we can attack silicate minerals in rocks. You know, the classic one you might think of as a forsterite mineral in a basalt, an olivine mineral, a basalt, being broken down by that acidity. And that transfers carbon into water, essentially, and then that carbon species is used to make new calcium carbonate in the ocean. A kind of first hint about sedimentology being important here. And so that pathway is really, really important. I'm not arguing that it's not important in this talk, but what I am arguing for is a recognition that there are other really key pathways to think about. The first, which I spent a lot of work in my PhD trying to quantify and understand, and onwards through recent work as well, is that if we erode organic carbon from the land surface, from soils and vegetation, we can move that organic carbon and put it into sedimentary reservoirs. And that acts as essentially a CO2 drawdown pathway as well. And it's quite sizable, and it's comparable in size to the silicate weathering drawdown pathway. I'm not going to talk about that actually today. What I am going to talk about is how weathering of sedimentary rocks, when they're exposed to these surface conditions, is a pathway of CO2 release. And this has been known for, you know, this isn't a new recognition, but what's I guess new is a drive to try and better constrain the fluxes, which are still poorly understood here. But also, you know, we need to understand what these releases of CO2, what they respond to, because that allows us to try and piece together how this long-term carbon cycle actually works. And the motivation for that is that CO2 is obviously a radiative, is a greenhouse gas that plays a major role in Earth's radiative energy balance, setting the surface temperature of the Earth. And this compilation by Foster et al. Shows proxy records of atmospheric CO2 for as long back as we have multiple of these. And I'm putting it up just to kind of set a bit of context here and try and, you know, show you the type of things that we're motivated by trying to understand. And that's that we know that CO2 has varied in the geological past. We know it's gone up and it's gone down. We know that the timescales over which those changes have happened have varied and may be related to climatic change itself, but also tectonic processes that modify Earth's surface from deep geological processes. And you can see this figure moving from kind of Phanerozoic timescales through to the Cenozoic kind of timescales, through to the records from the ice cores. And then also into the future, and I'll mention this, I won't go into this in detail, but we're also motivated by understanding how some of these natural carbon cycle transfers, which aren't you know, anywhere near as large as CO2 release from burning of fossil fuels and other impacts that humans are having on the carbon cycle. But these natural fluxes are there in the system, and how they respond moving forwards will govern, essentially partly govern our understanding of our remaining carbon budget. So these natural fluxes are important for that, especially if they have some sort of climatic sensitivity themselves. And the kind of what I'm going to now zone in on is what we're actually talking about and where this is happening. So this is a view of kind of what has been kind of various fields have converged to describe this zone of activity as the critical zone, essentially where life, water, and gases are interacting with rocks in the near surface. And these interactions are critical for a whole number of questions. And specifically for us, we're interested in how those interactions drive carbon transfers between atmospheric CO2 as a form of its greenhouse gas, and then other forms of carbon that may be removing that CO2 from the system. So the first thing I'm going to tell you about is this textbook kind of view about silicate weathering, and silicate weathering or chemical weathering of silicate minerals being a drawdown of CO2 that helps to stabilize the carbon cycle and Earth's climate. So in a chemical equation, if you think in chemical equations, which many people don't, but if you want to transfer that CO2 into another form, here's the way that this is done by silicate weathering, where we react CO2 and water as a carbonic acid with a calcium silicate mineral, and we produce dissolved calcium dissolved bicarbonate, and that's where the carbon is now found, and a secondary clay mineral. And there's another step in this reaction where the calcium and the bicarbonate are used to make new calcium carbonate in the ocean, and that locks up that carbon for long periods of time. So this is a crucial reaction that's happening in this kind of zone in this image on the right. And what we've known from decades of research trying to understand this is that if we increase runoff or temperature, we will increase these solute fluxes and therefore increase CO2 drawdown. So that's what I mean by stabilizing feedback. If CO2 goes up and you warm the planet and you make it wetter, then this reaction will act to draw down CO2 and try and stabilize. And the flip side for if CO2 is going down, you'd expect this reaction to kind of mitigate any large decreases as well. And a way to visualize that in data is to show you some data from volcanic islands where we've got silicate minerals in basalts being weathered here. And this compilation by Lee et al. Showing the bicarbonate concentration on the vertical axis, which is kind of a bit of a proxy for CO2 drawdown. It's quite crude, but it works here. And then the horizontal axis is temperature. And this data set is just one example of how we might try and understand that temperature response, for example. So here, temperature is increasing. We increase the amount of CO2 drawdown that this silicate weathering process drives. But what about so this is talking about weathering as a CO2 sink, but what about CO2 emissions and those two main pathways I've flagged? Well, they're absolutely critical to the carbon cycle, CO2 emissions. And this is because if you just have silicate weathering, this figure's showing this, if you just have silicate weathering increasing here by nominal amounts, by increasing by 25% in this diagram shows you if you increase that by that degree, how long it would take to strip all carbon from the atmosphere and ocean reservoir. And on this diagram, this is a kind of toy model, but it makes the point. In less than 1 million years, if you had an excess of 25% silicate rock weathering, you would strip the atmosphere ocean system of CO2. And we know that hasn't happened in at least with our proxy records and our understanding of Earth's surface temperature. So what that's telling us actually straight away, and what this paper by Berner and Caldera was trying to make a point about, was that you need the silicate weathering process must be responding to changes in CO2 inputs. And in this case, they were thinking about this and pitching this in terms of volcanic degassing or degassing from the solid Earth, and how that excess of degassing is then driving the sinks and probably not the other way around. So in terms of weathering, well, if weathering of certain rock types actually releases CO2, then we really need to understand what's going on, because that would then potentially drive silicate weathering as well. So what about these emissions from sedimentary rocks? They're not well known. We need ways to try and measure them. And this key question of could they be large enough and could they respond in a certain way to force changes in the global carbon cycle. And what I'm hoping is by the end of the talk, I'll convince you that we found ways to measure these things and that there's some really interesting patterns emerging. And I would say the answer is yes. So this is what I'm going to focus on. I haven't talked about sulfide minerals yet, but I will come on to that in a moment. These two pathways of weathering that release CO2. One is rock organic carbon oxidation, and the other sulfide oxidation. I'm going to come on to why these are a CO2 source in a moment. And perhaps another way to kind of pitch this, as earth scientists and geologists, we're really interested in thinking how the system's connected. And I think for this specific question, we have good reason to think that tectonic processes that expose sedimentary rocks through uplift and erosion processes that play a critical role in cycling material through the near surface. So that's kind of conceptualized on this diagram. These are likely to be really important. But what about climatic shifts? So hotter, wetter versus cooler climates, how are these going to trade off? And these are kind of the key questions that we're motivated by. So in this talk, after that introduction, I'm going to talk about a bit more about these reactions and what's happening. And I'm going to introduce you to a proxy that we've been using this trace element called rhenium that you may or may not have heard about before. And kind of, this is going to be a bit of a whirlwind tour, but I'm just want to introduce you to it, show you some of the take-home messages I think that we've found from that. And then I want to spend the majority of the talk, or at least half of it, I hope, on this new approach where we've been actually trying to directly measure CO2 emissions from sedimentary rocks exposed at the near surface. So this has involved some work with isotope geochemistry, looking at stable isotopes and radiocarbon to track the source of CO2 released in this critical zone area, and show you some data from France. And that data is leading to this punchline, which is that we've discovered a really strong temperature control on the CO2 release from these sedimentary rocks and the reactions I'll talk about. And so I'll try and synthesize and take that forward at the end. So this weathering of sedimentary rocks that I've referred to as being a CO2 source, what does that actually look like? Well, the first one is if you imagine organic carbon within a rock. You could picture here a leaf, or you could picture some marine plant organic matter that's been buried and concentrated in a shale. And when that is exposed to the near surface in oxygen and water or in gaseous form, you can essentially respire it, geo-respiration. So you can take the organic molecule, there's a simplified one there in the equation, you can oxidize it with oxygen, produce CO2, our greenhouse gas that we're interested in. The second pathway is a more indirect pathway, and it involves the oxidation. So it's still involving weathering, an oxidative weathering pathway, but we're using here sulfide minerals instead, such as pyrite. And this produces acidity, specifically sulfuric acid, that can actually dissolve carbonate minerals within rocks and release CO2 from the carbonate minerals. So the way that this works is here's our, the green is our sulfide mineral that we react with oxygen here and water again, and we produce an iron oxide, oxyhydroxide, sorry, and sulfuric acid here in orange. And that sulfuric acid can be used to react with a calcium carbonate mineral and release that carbon, which could be, Jurassic or whatever, and release that carbon back into the Earth system. So these are simplified reactions. There's other ways that these pathways can work, but these are the two main CO2 sources that we understand when we talk about sedimentary rocks and how they weather. Now, what does this all look like? Now, there's people in the audience here who have an awful lot of expertise in sedimentary rocks and their field exposures and their field outcrops, and I'm sure you've all seen this in the field. So here is an example of an extreme example. It's a black shale, so it's not a particularly common rock at Earth's surface, but it gives us a nice visual indication of what's happening. So the black shale here is weathering. The weathering we can see is a color change in this outcrop. And part of that weathering is losing the carbon, which is contained within that black shale. So the orangey material there has lost between 50 and 80% of the carbon that's present in the unweathered shales. This is a road cut through an outcrop or through a hillside that was forming over time. And then, yeah, the road cut allows us to look at the unweathered stuff in the middle and the weathered stuff. So this is the reaction that we think is happening. It's simplified, but so we have a couple of ways that we can try and understand this reaction. The first thing we could do is look at the residue of what's left behind. So we can look at that orangey, yellowy material and say, okay, how much carbon might have been lost? You know, what's the form of that carbon? What's the nature of that carbon? It can be a really powerful technique. The problem with that technique, that first one, is that we can't look at fluxes very easily. It's quite hard to quantify how fast has happened. The second option we might have is we could, well, measure the CO2 directly, surely. And actually, up until recently, we thought that was going to be incredibly difficult to do, mainly because the CO2 in the atmosphere, the CO2 being produced by plant roots, the CO2 being produced in the surface soil that we wouldn't want to track. We'd want to track what's happening due to the rock weathering. So we thought that was going to be quite challenging. But the second half of the talk will show that we've managed to do that now, actually. And then we've got another option, which is actually when these rocks weather, the oxidation reactions can release elements in different ways. And so if we can find an element that's associated with the organic carbon in the rock, but behaves in a way that we could track it, that'd be perfect. And the one that we focused on is this element rhenium. So I'm showing in this diagram, and I'll come on to this in the next few slides, that rhenium, when it's oxidized, forms a soluble anion, which is a lot of jargon basically to say that it's going to dissolve into water. And if it's dissolved in water, then, and that water's being captured by hydrological processes, we can go and sample a stream or a river and measure how much rhenium's coming out. And we can do that pretty accurately by sampling the river again and again and work out the mass of rhenium, that's dissolved rhenium, that's coming out of the landscape. And that can give us a way to understand and quantify fluxes. So I just thought I'd show kind of a visual image of perhaps, you know, how erosion is playing a role here and how this near surface zone is interacting and how it all works. I had the cartoon earlier. So this is an image from the Peruvian Andes, and hopefully what you can see in this image is a big landslide complex where we're seeing here shales being re-exposed to the surface and surface weathering reactions through this landslide process. And actually, it's more distributed than that. The shale is underneath the forest and the soil in the forest. So actually, the rocks are reacting over a much larger area than just that the exposed area. But the exposed area might actually be a hotspot of those reactions. And to understand this, I put this quote in because I think it shows kind of where we've come from. There was a bit of I guess a feeling in the literature that this rock organic carbon was really unreactive, and you know, why would it react in the near surface? And this is Hedges and Keel review paper here put it in this way, which is, well, if this fossil material has a reactivity of plastic and it's encased in brick, how is it respired? And actually, again, you know, many of you might be sedimentologists, and you might have been to outcrops like this. And I think you could probably answer that question as well as I could, which is, well, actually, when you look at some of these samples, they're physically and chemically, you know, their porosity and permeability is being altered. And you can actually imagine how you could start accessing those compounds within the rocks. So rhenium, I'm going to give you the kind of two main reasons why rhenium has been our target. The first one is that when you look at sedimentary rocks and organic carbon in sedimentary rocks, you find that rhenium and organic carbon are broadly associated, and you get, when you compile data, you get plots like this, which you don't get with all trace elements, but this works for rhenium. So carbon content, rhenium content, which is a good first step. Now, what's also interesting about rhenium is that rhenium is a big part of the osmium geochronology tool. So rhenium-187 over very long time periods decays to osmium-187 and provides a chronology tool. And so because of that, there's been an awful lot of work done by several people on where is rhenium within these organic phases. And that's shown actually that it's not just a passive correlation. Rhenium can actually be bound as a hydrogenous phase within the organic matter. And that, again, is very, very useful for us as a proxy. And then the second observation is that when these rocks, that's when the rocks are kind of being deposited, that seems to be being set in stone, if you like. When these rocks are then exposed, we see loss of rhenium from the rocks the same time as we see the loss of the organic carbon from the rocks. So I'm showing some data here from Taiwan, where the vertical axis is the carbon loss and the horizontal axis is the rhenium loss. We're just normalizing to an element that we don't think is largely affected by weathering. And there's also other examples I can show of this. This is a profile from New Zealand, where in gray we have rhenium being lost as we go towards the surface of this weathering profile, and we also have rock organic carbon being lost as we go towards the surface. And this was first shown by the Bernard Puka-Ehrenbrink's group in a 2002 paper that I cite there. And so then how this works is, in the solids, we see this loss, but actually to use the proxy, what we want to do is look at the rhenium where it went. So we end up measuring the concentration of rhenium in a dissolved phase in a river. So that's the rhenium mean is a mean concentration of rhenium in a stream or a river. QW is the amount of water flowing. And we combine those two things, we know the amount of dissolved rhenium that's leaving the landscape. If we then know something about the carbon rhenium ratio of the rock, then we can estimate how much carbon has likely been oxidized too. So I'll give you another example of some profile-based studies. So where we've tried to look at the paired loss of these components. So this is recent work that we did in the East River in Colorado. So I don't have time to go into the details of it, but on the left is, for people interested in carbon, is all the carbon stuff. So the carbon in any weathering profile, organic carbon in any weathering profile, is not just rock on a shale. You've actually got, plants living on top of that. They can input carbon from above. And so if we want to look at the loss of the rock organic carbon, we have to have a tool to account for that. So we use radiocarbon to do that. So on the left is the data that we use to look at the rock organic carbon. And that's on the right, then the rock organic carbon in orange through this profile. So we have less in the near surface and more at about meter depth in this one profile. And then in a neighboring profile, so the two profiles here within 3 meters, we have samples that we've digested and looked at rhenium, and we see a loss of rhenium again from depth to the surface, which fits the other weathering profiles that we've been looking at. And we have this loss of the two phases, two elements in these profiles. So with that in mind, what we then look at is what's leaving the catchment more broadly. So instead of just looking at a single profile through some rocks, we now say, okay, rhenium is being delivered through weathering reactions into water and leaving a catchment. So here we're sampling rivers as frequently as we can, and we're filtering the river water the river samples to recover the water, the dissolved components of weathering. And then we're measuring rhenium concentration in those dissolved components. And so this is a set of 3 Alpine catchments. So there's a few examples out there in the literature now of where we've used the rhenium approach. So I'll give you this example, but there are others out there. And yeah, we've looked at, as you can see in this diagram, the circles are the rhenium concentrations, so they're samples. The gray is the water discharge, the volume of water flowing per unit time. So we can combine those two things to work out how much rhenium is leaving these catchments. So in this study, we picked 2 pair catchments in the Swiss case, and they have quite different erosion rates. And then we had this third catchment in Colorado where we managed to get time series samples from as well. And the first thing we do is actually in this kind of hydrochemistry approach is to look at how those elements are responding to discharge. And that can be quite helpful to broadly characterize the catchment, but also to quantify fluxes. So here we've now got river flow, water flow versus the concentration of some elements of interest. So we're looking here at calcium. And the point of this is just to say that broadly speaking, in terms of kind of hydrochemistry, these three catchments share some similarities. But when we look at sulfate, which is a product of oxidative weathering in these catchments mainly, we see a contrast actually between them. So the blue is lower than the red. They're the two Swiss catchments. And then we see a higher concentration in the East River. And then the rhenium data on the right, it's a bit more messy. Part of that's analytical uncertainty. Part of that actually could be real in terms of, we think there might be some interesting seasonal pattern in rhenium production and export, but we don't have enough data to go into that. But anyway, the point is that the blue have low, the red are higher for the two Swiss. So they have a kind of contrast there straight away that we can see. And then the rhenium content in the East River is much higher in the river. So to look at these two Swiss catchments, a table is actually quite an effective way just to compare them. So I've said that they differ, and they differ in their sediment yield or erosion rates. So the Ellenbach delivers more sediments out of the catchments. It's more erosive than the Vogelbach, but they're very close to one another. So they have very similar runoff. So hydroclimates, the amount of water leaving the catchment per year. And you can see that they have quite similar dissolved calcium yields. But the two products of oxidative weathering here, sulfate and rhenium, show that the Ellenbach has more dissolved products from oxidative weathering than the Vogelbach. So this is telling us that erosion is potentially driving more oxidative weathering. And I'll come back to this in a moment because this fits a global pattern that we've identified. The next thing we do, again, I'm getting into some specifics, but I wanted to show you this because it is important, is think about where that dissolved rhenium is coming from. The way we do this is think about it in terms of other weathering products, and how do we have relative changes in, say here, rhenium to sodium ratio on the bottom axis or rhenium to sulfate ratio on the vertical axis. And what these allow us to do is separate potential different sources of rhenium. So in red, as an example, is what we think if you had a silicate rock and rhenium was coming from a silicate rock, that's what it would look like. And just to specify that the small red triangles there are rivers from Iceland, which are draining just basalt. So there's no rock organic carbon in these rocks and very, very little sulfides anywhere really in these catchments. And so they look like silicate rocks. Whereas the catchments in Switzerland and in the East River, they have more rhenium compared to sodium than we'd expect for a silicate source. They also have more rhenium compared to sulfate than we'd expect for the sulfide source. And we can use this kind of array, this mixing array. So these percentages there are trying to establish how much of the rhenium could come from the rock organic carbon pool. So this is what we've done as a key part of using the proxy. The other thing that we found when we looked at these Alpine catchments was an interesting behavior. Rhenium seemed to increase with its relative contribution seemed to increase with river flow. So when we went at high river flow, we found a higher amount of rhenium relative to sodium and high amount of rhenium relative to sulfate. And all three catchments showed these patterns, which is somewhat surprising because they have differences in erosion rate, they have differences in kind of hydroclimate, but the relative amount of rhenium seemed to increase with flow. And actually, we pondered this for quite a while, thinking about what this could be telling us. And I'm going to show you on the next slide that we think this fits our expectation of where we think rhenium is coming from and what we think rhenium is tracing. So really that observation helps to kind of form our thinking on rhenium as this proxy. So how this works is that you imagine producing different solutes in different kind of reactions, and those reactions can actually be scaled with kind of like, here it's a simple 1D depth, but it's kind of scaled in this case where oxygen is available. And the most oxygen that's available for oxidative weathering is in a kind of unsaturated zone near a surface of the catchment, where you've got gaseous oxygen able to diffuse into the rocks. As you get into the saturated zone, what happens is you use up dissolved oxygen quite quickly and you run out of dissolved oxygen quite quickly. And so oxidative weathering by oxygen becomes much more restricted. So this diagram is trying to get across some of those ideas. So on the right, the C is showing kind of a conceptual diagram of if we were to grind up rocks and look at how much they contained of sulfide minerals, of organic carbon, and silicate minerals with depth, what we might expect. And on the right are showing where we think we might pick up these different elements. So if rhenium was coming mostly from an oxidative weathering zone, as mostly coming from rock organic carbon, then we'd expect it to be enriched relative to other ions during high flow. As you flush those water, the water flushes through the near surface. Whereas in contrast, at low flow, the water takes a longer flow path. It gets deeper and the flow paths are longer. And we would expect the flow paths to pick up products of sulfide oxidation and of silicate weathering, while also obviously picking up the rhenium in the near surface. So that kind of behavior, that hydrochemistry behavior, we think supports quite strongly the use of this proxy for oxidative weathering. So this was a bit specific, but hopefully it was interesting. And if you're interested, please, check out these papers or ask some questions about it at the end. But just to wrap this kind of segment up, I wanted to just give some higher order things. So what have we learned so far from the rhenium proxy? The first thing I'd say is that this rock organic carbon oxidation can be a major component of these carbon transfers, and what we've conceptualized as transferring carbon between atmosphere CO2 and rock of various stores. And this rhenium has allowed us to look at the relative role. The second point is that we see globally, if we increase erosion, we increase dissolved rhenium flux. And that's not true for most weathering products. So rhenium seems to be behaving quite interestingly there. And we're interpreting that as that as you increase erosion, you increase this oxidation reaction and CO2 release. So actually, I'm going to skip this because it's a little bit complicated. But what I want to try and get across is that in some catchments around the world, river catchments around the world, here are, what have we got, about 9 or 10 river catchments sorted vertically there. We've tried to piece together these different bits of that diagram from the start. So we tried to look at silicate weathering and how much CO2 it draws down. So on this diagram, in a catchment, silicate weathering is going to be a light blue bar, and it's going to be a minus CO2 exchange. That's what it's telling us, that we're sequestering CO2. So we're going to be a negative on this axis. So what you can probably see if you're squinting is that the little blue bars seem to be relatively small, apart from one of the catchments, Guadeloupe. Then we've also looked at some of these other reaction pathways. So another sink is actually shown by the green bars, and this is where we erode organic carbon from the landscape and we potentially bury it. So those bars in a lot of places, I should add the caveat, these are mountainous locations, those bars are bigger than the silicate weathering. So already we have a bit of a shift away from kind of maybe our classic viewpoint of how the carbon cycle is operating. So this organic carbon erosion is really important. And then on the other side of the equation, the release pathways, the rock organic carbon oxidation here in gray is coming from our estimates of rhenium, the rhenium proxy. They have a lot more uncertainty, But what we're able to do now is look at, well, how do those things trade off against silicate weathering? How do they trade off against organic carbon burial? And hopefully what you can see is that in terms of the balance between silicate weathering and organic carbon weathering, if you like, in these catchments with sedimentary rocks, the silicate weathering doesn't seem to win very often. And again, that's a bit of a shift in terms of our understanding of how weathering impacts carbon budgets. So the other point I wanted to make, that second point, is shown in this diagram that we've been, chipping away, if you like, trying to find, data sets that and sample sets, and a lot of work by a lot of people has gone into various parts of the study. The first use of the rhenium proxy by Draix et al. in 2002. It's the light blue circle. And then it was a big hiatus, and I came along and worked in Taiwan again and looked at the rhenium proxy and found this link with erosion. And it seems to play out when we look at the Mackenzie River Basin, where erosion rates are lower. We found lower rhenium fluxes or lower estimated CO2 release. So this makes sense, this reaction, to me, because what we're doing is, when we're eroding a landscape, if we erode it quicker, what that means is you can get your rock mass through this oxidative window. You can kind of imagine that you get this rock mass quicker into your oxidative window. And that can increase the amount of reaction that you have and the amount of CO2 that you release. The flip side is that there's a lot of scatter in this proxy data. This is a logarithmic plot. Some of that scatter could be very simply just down to how much carbon is in the rock. And that's the dotted lines here showing, if you change the carbon content of a rock that's being eroded, what would you expect the relationships to look like? The other thing that could be happening, though, is that we could be having other constraints on these reactions. So some of the scatter could be related to changes in temperature, for example, changing the nature of the reactions in these landscapes. So after doing a lot of this work on rhenium, we realized we needed another method that could try and resolve some of these questions, because we don't seem to be able to do it with rhenium. Rhenium gives us this amazing, first order. Well, erosion's important, which is an important observation, but to get to the next step, we needed another approach. So here we are. How am I doing for time? Oh dear. Well, the good thing about this story is it's relatively simple. So I'm going to spend 15 minutes. I'll probably overrun by 5 minutes. Let's see how we do. This is the problem with doing it remotely, because I can't feel the room and I can't see you all looking at something else and falling asleep. But anyway, let's take you to this wonderful place in the south of France, the Draix-Bleone Critical Zone Observatory, where these rocks, these Jurassic marls are exposed. And these Jurassic marls contain rock organic carbon, they contain sulfides, and they contain carbonates. So they contain all the ingredients we think we could need to make CO2 emissions from this landscape. And it's incredibly well studied. So the two people there, Karen Laboutier, who oversees this observatory, and Sébastien Klotz, who's the research technician at the site, who has an awful lot of expertise in this landscape and measuring water fluxes, sediment fluxes, the hydroclimate. So we have all of that constraint. Wonderful place to do this type of investigation. And let's see if this works over your internet connection or mine. But anyway, this drone footage just gives you kind of a picture of this type of landscape. Maybe some of you have seen similar landscapes in other parts of the world. Essentially, these rocks are quite weak, so they erode quite rapidly. And there's a lot of exposure as a result of that. It's difficult for plants to colonize in these kind of landscapes. Also, there has been some deforestation and land use pressures in the recent past as well that's contributed to these kind of badlands landscapes. But there's a lot of exposed rock, a lot of places to try and study these reactions and how much CO2 they might be producing. So we were thinking about this carefully. How can we try and measure the reactions directly? And this is a methods paper we published a couple of years ago with Guillaume, thinking this through. And a traditional approach to measuring CO2 fluxes is to place a chamber on top of the surface that you're interested in and look at how much CO2 builds up. However, we couldn't simply do that here. One, because we thought the CO2 fluxes would be quite low. So when we calculated the kind of volume area relationships, we didn't know if we get enough signal with that approach, because the surface chamber, just by its shape, it's hard to get a large surface area to volume ratio. The second thing is that we wanted to make sure the CO2 is coming from rocks. So we wanted to measure and trap the CO2 to confirm that it wasn't just root respiration from plants or atmospheric leaks. Somehow we'd messed something up. So we came up with this plan to actually try and measure what was going on in the naturally fractured and permeated zone of weathering in the upper. Here we've drilled chambers for 40 centimeters in this rock mass. And so what that allows us to do is have a kind of internal chamber that collects gases internally and also allows us to trap the gases that are being produced for isotopic analysis. So this is an example of what we might do when we get to one of these chambers. We measure the CO2 concentration here in the vertical axis over a series of hours. And we manipulate the CO2 concentration. So where you see the big drops, we're deliberately removing CO2 from the chamber, but we're not changing the pressure. We're just removing CO2. And then we let the CO2 build back up. And then we remove the CO2 again. And we let the CO2 build back up and we remove. And we keep doing that. And that allows us to quantify how much CO2 is coming out of this one spot in France over time. The other cool thing that we can do, which is Mark Garnett as part of the project, is that we can trap the CO2 onto a zeolite mineral, which is stable, and we can take that trapped CO2 back to the laboratory, and we can get it off the trap and measure its stable isotope composition and its radiocarbon activity. And that's really crucial for understanding where that CO2's come from. And so what we did is we installed a set of chambers over an outcrop in this catchment in France with different positions relative to the local river beds. And we tried to get to these sites as often as we could. We also measured temperature within the rock face using similar kind of a chamber, dummy chamber. And this image shows our gas measurement and sampling case connected here to chamber H6. So you can see some tubing, drain pipe tubing. That's not a chamber. That's just something to store something else inside. The chamber is within the fractured rock face. So what we did was we visited seasonally through time. So we'd visit for about a week, make intense measurements at these sites, trap gases, and then we would revisit a few months later and so on. So initially, we just wanted to see if it worked. And the methods paper was a lot about that. It was like, well, actually, can we measure the CO2 fluxes? Are they large enough? How can we do this? And actually, it was the second and third trips where we started to get excited. So here's what it kind of looked like. We had this is examples from 2 chambers where we're measuring CO2 flux on the vertical axis. We're measuring temperature, which is the black line within the rock face. And we're seeing these CO2 fluxes are different for different chambers. I'll come on to this in a moment, but they both were increasing. And so at this point of the research, we got really excited. What's this about? What's happening? But it wasn't until the temperature started to go down and we revisited in winter that we could see, is there something interesting here? Is it linked between temperature and CO2 release? Or, have we done something really bizarre to the substrate and we're just going to see CO2 keep increasing or something? We weren't actually sure until actually it panned out. And so as soon as that CO2 flux dropped back down again in February, we knew we had to just keep measuring this at least for another year to see what we had and try and understand how this was working. So here's the two chambers. This is raw data. So each circle is say an hour or 2 hours in front of the chamber measuring the CO2 flux. So I'm going to go through this. As I said, that's the primary data. So what you can then do is obviously just plot it against temperature. So that's what we've done here. So here's the temperature inside the chamber versus the CO2 flux. And there's two things that are really important to take away on this plot. The first is that both of the chambers, despite having different magnitudes of flux, so that you can see the purple chamber versus the light green chamber, have different amounts of CO2 being released, but their response with temperature is the same, basically. So this thing called the Q10, which we're showing, is essentially the nature of the exponential fit. And it shows that Q10 means that with a 10 degrees temperature change, that's how much you increase the CO2 flux. So Q10 of about 2 means that you're doubling the CO2 flux every 10 degrees. So then the absolute fluxes are different, but the temperature sensitivity looks very similar. The second thing, obviously, to note was that the fluxes were different, and we think that this is quite interesting because when we look at all the chambers together, we see that if we just go back a slide, we can quantify the intercept at 0 degrees, which is kind of an amplitude parameter. And when we do that, we see that that amplitude parameter, which are the symbols, seems to increase as we go away from the local river bed. And we think that this is related to kind of gas exchange within the weathering zone. So as we're further away from the riverbed, we've got more airspace and we've got more oxygen coming in, CO2 coming out, whereas near the river, we've got less airspace and such. But let's not get too bogged down with the absolute fluxes, because actually it's the overall response that's quite striking. So if you normalize every chamber, and this isn't a simple normalization where we're just taking the average flux over the measurement period for each chamber, and then we're just looking at the normalized flux. This is now 4 chambers across this outcrop. And we see the really common response with the seasonality that's linked to the temperature response. The other thing, so yeah, I'll just say that that's a really powerful observation in terms of combining multiple measurements of different absolute flux, but their response to temperature is extremely similar. There's an important secondary control on the CO2 flux by hydrology, which we discussed in the paper. So this looks like that when it rains, we see a rapid reduction in CO2 flux that you measure in your chamber, but it lasts about a day, and then the CO2 flux recovers. And we think what's happening there is that the CO2 is the carbon is being moved in water laterally away from the reaction site. And you actually see this is a month-long experiment I'm showing data for that Guillaume measured. So I won't go into that because I want to get on to these important points about the source of this. So then putting this together, the figure on the right is us now normalizing the data to that amplitude parameter. So we've now got 5 chambers of data here, and the 5 chambers of data, you put them all together. You don't do any screening for hydrology. You just say, well, we're going to treat all the data the same. And we see this temperature response. Increase the temperature, increase the CO2 flux, and it's about every 10 degrees, you double the CO2 flux. And that temperature sensitivity is remarkably similar to some organic soils. So recent organic matter that's fallen from a tree, it reacts similarly, it responds similarly to changes in temperature as this organic matter within these miles. Now, in terms of the source of those gases, I mentioned this earlier on, we can either kind of have an organic source or a carbonate source. So the way that we distinguish between those is using stable isotopes. So the horizontal axis here, it's very different for a carbonate and an organic phase of carbon. So you can see that separation on the horizontal axis between the stars, the little red stars of carbonate and the gray squares of organic matter. And then on the vertical axis, we have radiocarbon, which allows us to look at inputs of recent atmospheric CO2 into the system. And actually, we ended up seeing something very interesting there. So that this triangle is what you'd expect if you mixed atmospheric CO2 with these 2 components. And when we wrote the methods paper, that's kind of what we explained was going on. We thought maybe we've got some CO2 coming into the apparatus from the atmosphere. Maybe we're trapping that somehow. But actually, when we thought a bit more about how the chamber works, it's really difficult to get atmospheric CO2 into the chamber because the pressure of CO2 and the partial pressure of CO2 in the chamber is so high that it should always be going out to the atmosphere. So actually instead, we now interpret this as atmospheric carbon dioxide is coming into the system through carbonate weathering, which produces a pool of dissolved organic carbon. And then what's happening is that when you have sulfuric acid that you produce from the sulfides and it mixes with that water, it can release the CO2 out of that pool, which is the square I have there, the blue square. So if you just drop sulfuric acid onto the carbonate, you'll end up at the red triangle. If you drop sulfuric acid onto this carbonate pool, this dissolved carbon pool, you'll get the blue square. And if you have rock organic carbon oxidation, you'll get the light gray squares. So this is our mixing domain that we've described. And we can partition those components and try and understand how they change. And then we can think about that seasonal pattern and think about not just total CO2 coming out of these rocks, but actually say, is it carbonate or organic carbon derived, and try and understand, therefore, the processes that are driving this. So that's kind of the end of the data and actually almost the end of the talk. So thanks for sticking with me. There's not too many, I think there's 2 more slides to go. So I'll just end with this, this push on the final slide. So the caveat is that we've only measured this in one location for one rock type in France. And obviously that's not enough. We need to do more. But I think that the data we found really gives us impetus to do more, because we found that the CO2 release from sedimentary rock weathering increases with temperature for both the carbonate derived and the organic derived components. And that means weathering in these settings with these rocks could be a positive feedback to climate. It's not a stabilizing feedback anymore. So if you increase temperature, this reaction would increase your CO2 release. So it kind of forces then silicate weathering, another CO2 drawdown, to kind of compensate for that. So that's not something that we model at the moment. It's not something that we conceptually model, and it's not something that we put into a system carbon cycle models for geological time. So I think that that is a really important thing to work out. One, is this more widespread? And second, how does this actually force the carbon cycle and introduce these links between erosion weathering and carbon transfers? So I'll end there, but I've got a few kind of concluding points that I'll just flag, although I can't see them because I'm looking at there's a Zoom window. So the first is that to say that from the Rhenium proxy, we've understood that this release of CO2 from sedimentary rock weathering can be substantial, and it can be larger than silicate weathering drawdown, where we've got sedimentary rocks. And therefore lithology is really important. So, I mean, that's kind of a no-brainer. If we've got sedimentary rocks which we do in a lot of mountainous areas, and a lot of Earth's surface is covered by sedimentary rocks, the CO2 release can counter the sinks. And then we have this observation from measuring CO2 fluxes directly, that we see rock organic carbon oxidation and sulfide oxidation seem to be very strongly linked to temperature in a way that you describe it as a positive feedback. So, these key things: what is this temperature control? How widespread is it? There are a whole host of other interesting questions about how geomorphic processes and the geomorphic setting of a location could play a role. Key things are the role of landsliding and the role of floodplains in this story. And then also, the modeling community, I think this provides a really interesting component that hasn't been explored in terms of the sensitivities that this introduces, and could change the way that we model the long-term carbon cycle. So with that, I'll end. And if you've got any questions, please feel free to ask me now, or fire me an email. And yeah, thanks for the invite, and thanks for listening. And yeah, hope to see you at a conference, or perhaps in Liverpool or in Oxford at some point down the line as well. So thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Rob Duller has a lot of problem with his connection, so I'm going to be leading the questions. Rob has some questions, but I'll ask them. I'll open the floor to people, to participants here. So if anyone has a question. Guess not. I'll start with Rob's first question then.
Anthony, I could ask you, and it's stable for now. If it goes off, then jump in.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, no. Oh, no, not a question, it's a statement. Okay, so I've got loads of questions, but my first question, you might have answered it along the way. I think you did answer it halfway through, but I got so excited that I wrote it down. And was how robust is the rhenium value? I guess you did answer it later on. So you've used rhenium as a proxy for carbon, but there's a lot of scatter in there, and suppose and I know that you did touch on this later, but you do see it as a broad brush proxy, catchment-wide erosion sort of landscape scale. Is that the case?
Yeah, definitely. I think we can do a lot of refining of how we use it, and I think that there's like two components to it. One is making sure that you get accurate fluxes from a landscape, which I think we can definitely do. And then the approach is to saying, well, where do we think it's coming from? Which reactions do we think it's coming from? And that's the bit that we're still trying to push. So it's never going to be a one-to-one perfect proxy. It's an element that is not carbon, and we're interested in carbon, but I think it's the best that we have at the landscape scale. And if you pick your catchments well, you can imagine that you're trying to look for signal, right? So you're trying to say, well, do I see big signals and big changes that are larger than the noise of the proxy, if that makes sense. That's probably my philosophy on it.
Yeah, and sort of part B, I suppose, was that, maybe you explained it, but was kind of, you've got this water sample, it's this volume, you've got parts per million or whatever, and then you use that to somehow link to a rock, and I suppose that comes with the whole package, right, as a proxy. Is it sort of, is that right? Yes. Okay.
That's relatively,
I think that question.
That kind of makes sense, because that's how we quantify, say, carbonate weathering or silicate weathering. We look at like the dissolved calcium or the dissolved sodium, and we know it must come from somewhere. And so actually there's analogies. So for sodium, for example, you make a big correction in some catchments because sodium's delivered through rainfall. So you have to correct the sodium budget based on precipitation inputs. And it's the same for a lot of elements when you're trying to use them to track the you want to look at the reactions in the rock. But yeah, one of the things we want to do, but it's a bit challenging to set up, but it's been done for other elements, is you imagine at the local scale, you install sensors within quite a small area to track where these things are coming from. And that we haven't focused on that yet, but it's kind of a no-brainer to try and do that as well, and help refine the proxy, I think.
Yeah, cool. Yeah. Anyone else got any questions? Because I could just ask some more.
I got one actually. Yes. When you're talking about the reactions kinetic, actually, how important is the permeability of the rock you are weathering? So, for instance, if you have low permeability rock, you would allow, I guess, the water to interact longer with the rock, whereas like something more permeable might flush this water quicker and therefore have a less concentrated rhenium or carbon at the end.
Thanks, Anthony. That's a great question. I'm actually really excited about this question at the moment, because I think it provides a link between actually almost the geological history of the rock itself, but actually more, it provides a link between physical weathering and physical processes, or fracturing, jointing, tectonic, physical disaggregation of rocks near the surface, and the chemical reactions that are happening. So what I think is absolutely key is being able to allow these minerals to come into contact with oxygen in gas form or in water. And if you have a low porosity, low permeability rock, this reaction is going to be shut down. Like, there's not going to be any way that you can access those minerals. So in Drax, we've got quite an extreme example, because it's bedded at like centimeter scale. And I think that's probably, and it's fractured as well. And it's also, there's freeze-thaw cycles that produces a lot of like looser regolith. But actually in some shales or sedimentary rocks, you might not have that same thing going on, and you might actually protect a lot of that material. So I'm just going to digress a bit because I think this is interesting. If you have carbonate and sulfides in your rock, there's this really interesting discussion at the moment that if the sulfide oxidizes first, it produces porosity and increases permeability. And then the sulfide acidity dissolves carbonate, and that increases and there's all these really interesting interactions between the physical and the chemical reactions at the grain scale that are really fascinating. Anyway, I hope that answers your question, or do you have a follow-up?
No, that's really cool. Yeah, you answered it really well. Yeah, thanks. By the way, quickly, I'm just going to quickly say we're going to keep recording for the questions. So if anyone needs to leave or anything, because we passed the time, but I'm going to keep recording and we can keep having questions, and then it's going to be uploaded on YouTube later, so we can keep on having questions for longer time as well. So Rob, if you have more questions.
Sorry, yeah, I realized the time. Yeah, this time's flown. I was going to ask a really simple one actually at the end. So, given that that the relationship between temperature and the carbon dioxide, a simple one, which is, I guess it could boil down to slope aspect. The color of the rock, anything that might govern temperature. I guess is that. I guess you can investigate that to some extent. How important is that? If you were to sample on the other side of the river, I mean, with that control, I guess it would control to some extent, wouldn't it?
What we're trying to figure out at the moment, because obviously, so I guess there's the positives of the rhenium approach give you this catchment view, right? The positives of the really specific, one chamber measuring CO2 is that it allows us to unpack that temperature control, but it's much more difficult to join the dots between the two. And that's the bit that actually is really interesting. So your question, we actually had installations on a north and a south slope.
Yeah.
And one of the things we were interested in Drax is, and this has been observed in soil organic matter, is that as you go too hot, you actually find, if it's a biotically driven reaction, that it gets too hot, right? And the life that's in there that's dry, the microbiology. So we were wondering on the south face whether in the summer we might actually see a kind of almost a limit, and we think that could. We don't have any data, but we thought that was going to be really interesting.
Yeah.
But we didn't get that. But we do know that on some of these rocks, from the temperature installations, the surface temperature, near surface temperature of these dark rocks in August in the south of France can get crazy high. They can get up to 70 degrees. But what's interesting is if you look in then the chamber rarely gets above 35. So, it depends kind of where. So yeah, your question's got multiple aspects, but I guess we've been trying to think about this, in terms of, I think the key thing is, could that temperature response get limited at high temperature? I think that's critical.
Yeah.
And then thinking about upscaling. So if you wanted to upscale the CO2 measurements, which bit of the temperature data do we use? And how do we think about insulation? That's something that we've been also pondering.
Cool. So by the way, if I get a chance to sort of say it's brilliant work. Well done. There's lots of stuff in there. Really well done.
Thanks. So sorry, I wanted to show you guys some sedimentary rocks, and I realized that I could have probably done a bit more on the rhenium stuff, but the gas stuff has been so exciting to do because it was just hugely risky. We didn't know if it was going to pan out, and it's one of those things where it's just an example where it did pan out, and I guess it doesn't always work that way, but and we've been trying to think actually about the type of outcrops that we might use in the future. And we've been trying to simplify the method so that you can take it to other places. And, this was really intensive, a lot of work that we put in. So is there a way we can simplify it and we can explore different lithologies, different metamorphic grades, things like porosity and permeability, and linking that into the story as well.
Yeah, sounds cool. I mean, you need to see. Yeah, you definitely need more sedimentary rocks.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, actually, I had more questions as well. One is probably quite quick. It's on the slides where you were comparing different rivers, and there's the transition to the second study, I think.
Yeah. Okay.
I was wondering, like, maybe it's me and the sedimentology nomenclature that I'm not really knowing well or something, but like you had some that were sequestrating carbon, some rivers, and then some that were at the top that were releasing carbon. I was wondering if, like, in these, like, when you compare the rivers, if one has like more affluents where you do the measurement, like how is that? Because they then have like more volume of rock they erode compared to others. So is that graph taking that part into account? Maybe it's the word catchment that I don't know.
Yeah, no. So what we try to do, so yeah, it's a really important question. So the biggest catchments are on that graph, like by a long way, are the ones in the middle. The Arctic Red, the Peel, and the Mackenzie. They're very large areas, and so what tends to happen as you go to larger areas and larger catchments is that you're sampling broader areas, and they're not all eroding very quickly. So a lot of these fluxes seem to scale with erosion, so the relative fluxes go down. Whereas if you look at just a small mountain catchment like the Liwu, which is the second one on there, that's in Taiwan, it's about 400 kilometers squared in size. It's steep everywhere. It's really erosive, and it's kind of like we've deliberately gone to those places to try and see signal and try and understand process. So what we wanted to get out of this figure was to show where we had data, and the point is we don't have a huge amount of places we can try and link these things together and see what fell out. So what falls out is if you've got sulfides around, which is the blue bar, if they're there, that dark blue bar is really important. The other thing we wanted to fall out is that if you don't have any sedimentary rocks, life is nice and simple. So that's Guadalupe down at the bottom. That's a volcanic catchment, a pair of catchments that have been studied. So yeah, I think this was quite a fun review to write in that regard, because we were trying to work out, well, what do we have data on, and where could we push next? But yeah, geochemists worry a lot about, if you're looking at a catchment and you're making measurements of the stream chemistry, what are we capturing? Which bit of the reaction are we actually capturing best? Can we compare that catchment to that catchment? And that's probably a second order for us in this diagram, is worrying about how we compare things. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's really cool. I have one. I think I'll stop it after that. One last question.
That's right, I don't mind.
So on volcanic island or in volcanic areas, these waters might be able to interact with the hydrothermal system, so heat up the fluids, and also maybe get more acid by, I don't know, incorporating some gases from the hydrothermal system. So with that, well, I'm actually not really sure what my question is then. The fluids chemistry will change. Will that surely will change the weathering of the rocks that they're going through back up? And is there a way basically to measure this? Or
yeah, I think it's really important. I think for oxidative reactions, it's a bit more complicated, because you can oxidize without oxygen, clearly. There's lots of really important other oxidative kind of redox electron shuttles, almost, if you like. But for these reactions, the deep processes what might be more important for rock organic carbon, for example, might actually not be so much like the high temperature fluid interaction. It could actually be more that if you metamorphose the organic matter, you change its potential reactivity. So that's something we're interested in. But the other point you're making, say, about volcanic islands, yeah, it is important, because what you're doing there is you're potentially decoupling the chemical weathering and alteration of the rocks from the surface conditions. So one of the points that people have made in Taiwan, for example, is that a lot of water can get really quite deep, and it can have quite long residence time, and it could contribute to hydrothermal systems and springs. And actually that can drive a lot of silicate weathering of these rocks. But that silicate weathering has no connection to surface temperature. And so that means that your kind of link between silicate weathering and temperature is very, very loose in those settings. So yeah, one of the ways we try and get at it, I suppose, would be to looking at streams and hydrothermal systems directly, you know, looking at the chemistry of those waters, trying to understand the reactions that are operating. And a lot of that understanding, you know, is relevant to understanding hydrothermal systems as well. So yeah, it's something we're interested in. I haven't connected to it as much as we could, but yeah, it's a good question.
Cool, thanks. Okay, well, I think we'll stop the questions for now. I'll stop the recording.